Good evening. Continuing our way through the minor prophets, we're up to Habakkuk. Habakkuk is a interesting and unusual prophet for a number of ways. For one thing, when you hear the term prophet, what sort of a man, what sort of individual comes to mind? Okay, yeah. I mean, if you did an image search for just about any of them, that's what you get, right? An older man, big heavy beard. I think a lot of times we think about the prophets, and I mean, to a certain extent they definitely were, as the religious leaders, right? The spiritual supermen of their days and age. Habakkuk is actually, he is the prophet who questions God. And hopefully that'll make sense as we go through and look at this study this evening. Right away, as we look at just sort of the basic background of the book, Habakkuk opens the burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see. All right, so we're introduced. This is all by the way, background information we have about this individual. He gives us his name, Habakkuk. Here's one of the things that's interesting about it. That's not a Hebrew name. That appears to be Akkadian, which Akkadian was sort of the diplomatic language of that day and age. It was the closest thing they had to a universal language that the various kingdoms, the courts, could use to communicate with each other. It's believed to mean embrace, which Martin Luther then described Habakkuk as one who took his nation to his heart, and comforted it, and held it up. And that does certainly sort of seem to fit what we see with Habakkuk. As far as his home, we don't know. Almost certainly it was in Judah because he speaks about events that are going to directly affect Judah. He does make some references to Jerusalem, 2:17 for example. He mentions the city, which almost certainly is Jerusalem. Habakkuk 2 and verse 20, there's maybe the second most famous statement in the book of Habakkuk, where we read that Jehovah is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So maybe he lived in Jerusalem or near Jerusalem. That seems to be consistent with what we see. We don't know even necessarily his occupation, although the only two times Habakkuk is mentioned by name anywhere in the Bible, both cases occur in this book, and in both cases he is described as Habakkuk the prophet. Habakkuk 1:1, Habakkuk 3 verse 1. The reason that may be significant is typically those who are referred to as the prophet were individuals who held a court position. Like we read about in the days of David, Nathan the prophet. Later on, we have Isaiah the prophet. Isaiah, who very often interacted directly with some of the kings. Same thing with Jeremiah. Maybe Habakkuk was one of those sort of court prophets. Don't know for sure. Just based off of his introduction, we're not even given anything that tells us about the date. Several of these prophets, you remember, they start by saying the prophecies of so-and-so, which they saw in the days of this king or that king, and they allow us to get a more accurate historical background. Habakkuk doesn't even do that. But he does mention two events that are telling when it comes to trying to date the book. And honestly, we could probably give a closer window for Habakkuk than just about any of the other prophets. Habakkuk 1 and verse 6. This is God speaking to Habakkuk, by the way. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation that marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. The Chaldeans, we know them better as... Does anybody happen to remember? We know them better as the Babylonians. So evidently this is just before, or it seemed to be just before, the Babylonians begin their march. There's also the statement Habakkuk 3 and verse 16, where now Habakkuk is the speaker. I heard and my body trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered into my bones, and I tremble in my place because I must wait quietly for the day of trouble, for the coming up of the people that invadeth us. He ends awaiting the invasion of Babylon. So it seems, here's what we've got. Babylon is coming, but they're not there yet. Babylon defeats, and the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, defeat Assyria. They conquer Nineveh in 612 BC, and they become the world power. 606 BC is when they first invade, or 605 BC rather, is when they first invade Judah. And so we've got a 6 to 7 year window there between their coming to power and their finally directly invading Judah that seems to fit our time frame for Habakkuk. This would place Habakkuk shortly after Nahum. Remember, Nahum prophesied about the fall of Assyria and the destruction of Nineveh at the hands of the Babylonians. He'd be more or less a contemporary with Jeremiah and Zephaniah, who were going to live to see Babylon actually conquer and take Jerusalem. So, giving us that time period, we can go back to our historical books and look at a little bit about what exactly was going on in Judah at this point in time. In 608 BC, King Josiah, who was the last good king of Judah, is killed in battle against Pharaoh Necho in Egypt. He is succeeded then by Jehoahaz, who will reign for only 3 months before the Egyptian depose him and put in place Jehoiakim, who will last 3 years before the Babylonians invade, depose him, and put up their own puppet king. Both of these individuals, Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim, are described as wicked kings. 2 Kings 23, verse 32, Jehoahaz, he did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah, according to all that his fathers had done. You skip down just a few verses, you're going to read exactly the same thing about Jehoiakim. We also know from the prophecies of Jeremiah that Jehoiakim also actively persecuted God's prophets. There was one prophet that he chased all the way down to Egypt, brought back to Jerusalem, and had put to death. And so that is the background of the nation of Judah when Habakkuk comes on the scene. His style and his basic approach is unique among the prophets. Typically speaking, I mean, even think about this, a prophet was one who spoke for whom? God. So typically speaking, the direction was from God to the people. That's typically the way that a prophet communicated. Habakkuk pretty much does the opposite. He is taking the people's questions, his questions and concerns before to God. Look, for example, here, and we'll come back in and we'll fill in the details, but I just want to illustrate the style here of Habakkuk for the moment. Look at verse 2. Habakkuk 1 and verse 2, Habakkuk asked, O Jehovah, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? I cry out unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. And so throughout chapter 1, there's a conversation that goes on between Habakkuk and God. Like I said, we'll come back and we'll fill in some of these details in a second. You come down to chapter 2 and verse 1, and Habakkuk says, I will stand upon my watch, and set me upon the tower, and will look forth to see what he will speak with me, and what I shall answer concerning my complaint. He's got questions. He's got things that don't seem to make sense to him, and he's coming to God, and he's hoping for answers. Now, that being said, he is a prophet. He does speak for God. As a matter of fact, when you come to Habakkuk 2 and verse 2, Jehovah answered me and said, write the vision, and make it plain upon tablets, that he may run that readeth it. He is speaking for God. He does have a message from God for the people and for us today, but the basic format is a little bit different. There's this conversation between Habakkuk and God that takes up the first 2 chapters, and then the 3rd chapter is Habakkuk's poetic reflection upon what he has learned. It's written in very beautiful poetry, that in many ways is more comparable to the Psalms than the other prophetic books. And it ends with one of the most beautiful declarations of all, the Old Testament. Thematically, Habakkuk does share some similarities with other Old Testament books. For one, like Job, Habakkuk asks some challenging questions about the apparent triumph of the wicked. I mean, that's what he's asking there in Habakkuk 1 and verse 2. How long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? I cry out to thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. Habakkuk wants to, remember, he is living in a time period where the kings he knows, are wicked. They're persecuting the faithful people of God. And what's Habakkuk wanting to know? How long is this going to go on? God, when are you going to step in and do something? Because it seems like the wicked are flourishing. In that sense, it bears some similarities to the book of Job. It also, and this is looking ahead just a little bit, it bears some similarities to Nahum. Because Nahum prophesies against Assyria. Assyria comes and conquers the northern kingdom of Israel, and Nahum is God saying, I'm going to repay them in turn. Habakkuk is going to be about Babylon coming and taking Jerusalem, and God saying, I'm going to punish them in turn. So there's some similarities there. But the focus of Habakkuk is really upon something else entirely. And this is the most famous statement in the book of Habakkuk. If you look at Habakkuk 2 and verse 4, behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright in him, but the righteous man shall live by his faith. Frank J. Dunn puts it this way. He says, Habakkuk's purpose is to justify the ways of God to man and to console the Jews whose exile in Babylon was imminent. We're going to dig into this in just a second. But the point is, Habakkuk is looking around and he's not understanding the way the world is working. It's not making sense to him. Have you ever been there? Yeah. And what is the great conclusion of the book? What does God say here? How is the righteous person going to live? By faith. It's interestingly, in the 2nd, 3rd century, there was the Talmud put together, which is the great Jewish commentary on the Old Testament. All of their various rabbinic traditions and interpretations are combined into this. And there's a statement in the Talmud about Habakkuk. They say, Moses gave Israel 613 commandments. David reduced them to 10, Isaiah to 2, but Habakkuk to 1. The righteous shall live by his faith. And that is the great theme of the book of Habakkuk. And a practical examination of what it means to live by faith. So, there's a simple 3-point outline of the book that has been suggested, and this is the outline I'm going to kind of use as we look through the text itself. First of all, chapters 1 and 2 primarily faith-tested. This is where Habakkuk asks questions because things don't make sense to him. Chapter 2 and most of chapter 3 is faith-taught. God answers some of Habakkuk's questions, and he helps him to see things in a different way. And then the end of the book, the last 4 verses, are faith triumphant. All right, so first idea, faith tested. As we noted, Habakkuk is living in this time of corruption and evil, and his fundamental question is, when is God going to do something? O Jehovah, this is verse 2, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? I cry out unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. Why dost thou show me iniquity, and look upon perverseness? For destruction and violence are before me, and there is strife, and contention riseth up. Now, this is kind of interesting, because very often you see prophets, like, for example, Jonah. Who was he sent to? Nineveh. He's asking for judgment against Nineveh, but that's also a foreign power. Habakkuk is asking, who is he looking at and seeing this wickedness among? His own people. And he wants to know, God, when are you going to do something about this? And God's response is, I am doing something. Come down to verse 5. This is now God speaking to Habakkuk. Behold ye among the nations, and look and wonder marvelously. For I am working a thing in your days which ye will not believe, though it be told you. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation that march through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. All right, so Habakkuk says, God, why aren't you doing something? God says, I am doing something. What's he doing? He's bringing the Chaldeans. He is bringing the Babylonians as an instrument of justice and judgment against his people. Now this raises another question for Habakkuk. You come down to chapter 1 and verse 13. Thou that art, this is Habakkuk now speaking back to God. Thou that art of purer eyes than to behold evil, and thou canst not look on perverseness, wherefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously, and holdest thy peace when the wicked swalloweth up the man that is more righteous than he? Now keep in mind, in the context of Babylon coming against Judah, who's the wicked man swallowing up? Babylon, right? The Chaldeans. Who's the more righteous individual? Judah. He's just said, God, why aren't you doing something? Don't you see how bad things are getting? And God says, here's what I'm going to do. And Habakkuk says, that doesn't make sense. You're going to use them to punish us. They're worse than we are. Judah might be bad. Babylon's bad, right? That's part of it. It goes back to, God said right there in verse 5, look, I'm going to tell you what I'm doing. You're not going to believe it, but let me tell you. You see, it did not make sense for a holy God to punish Judah by an even wickeder or more wicked Chaldean empire, the Babylonians. All right, just on this point, let me draw a few lessons. One, God's schedule won't always make sense to us. Because you go back and you look at the very first question that Habakkuk asked. How long? Now at this point, what is he expecting? Because he doesn't actually phrase it in the terms of, what are you going to do? What does he ask? How long? The assumption is what? The assumption is God is going to do something. The question is, when? Why has it not been done yet? God does not always give us, as a matter of fact, he almost never gives us the schedule. He tells Abraham, I'm going to make you the father of many nations. How long did he have to wait for that? 25. Obviously, he never saw it fulfilled in totality. He had to wait 25 years just for that first child to get the whole thing started. The Lord's return. How long have we been waiting for that? 2,000 years, give or take. How long will we wait for that? I don't know. And we could all probably add our own personal how longs to that list, right? People want to know, why am I not married yet? Why do I not have a family yet? How long am I have to wait for this career that I've been hoping for and praying for? Those questions, they test our faith, just like this question of how long tested Habakkuk's faith. You know what we've got to learn to do? Be patient. God has his own schedule, and God's schedule is better than ours. Psalm 27 and verse 14, wait for Jehovah, the psalmist says. Be strong and let thy heart take courage. Yea, wait thou for Jehovah. Here's a second lesson out of this first section. God's plans won't always make sense to us. I mean, that's what Habakkuk is saying, right? When God says, I'm going to punish you with the Chaldeans, what? If anything, the Chaldeans are the ones who really, if you're making up a schedule of who ought to be punished first, they ought to be punished before we are because they're worse than we are. How can God use them to punish us? Think about in the New Testament. Paul describes the cross as a stumbling block to the Jews, right? He describes preaching as foolishness. When have God's ways ever made sense to man? Almost never. And frankly, that's a good thing. Because we mentioned earlier, The idea, we mentioned Abraham and Sarah, right? Sarah getting pregnant didn't seem to make sense. So what do? Go around. We'll help things out, right? Here's a way that makes more sense to us. Go into my handmaid. How did that work out? Made it worse, right? When we start meddling in God's plans, thinking we're going to help God along, we make a bigger mess of things. God said through Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith Jehovah. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Paul would say it this way, 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 15, that the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Trust that the way God is going to do it is going to be best. And then there's also the fact that God can use anything and anyone. The Chaldeans, yes, they were a wicked people. He describes them there in verse 6 as bitter and hasty. Goes on, verse 7, they are terrible and dreadful. God was able to use them. But by the way, just because God is able to use something or someone does not mean He approves of them and what they are doing. And that leads us then kind of into our next point. Faith being taught. See, God has a plan. And like a lot of God's plans, they're a multi-step plan. Step one, God's going to use the Chaldeans to punish Judah. And Habakkuk's big question now at this point is how? That doesn't make sense. Well, that's not the entirety of God's plan. Step two is Babylon is going to be punished. And much of chapter 2 actually describes that. As a matter of fact, when you get down to about verse 6, through the remainder of the chapter, God starts to list a number of woes that are going to come upon Babylon. Verse 6 and following. "Shall not all these take up a parable against him, and a taunting proverb against him, and say, Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his? How long, and he that ladeth himself with pledges? Shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee, and awake that shall vex thee? And thou shalt be booty unto them. Because thou hast plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder thee, because of men's blood, and for the violence done to the land, to the city, and to all that dwell therein. The one that plundered is going to be punished. Woe upon them." Verse 9. "Woe to him that getteth an evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the hand of evil. Thou hast devised shame to thy house by cutting off many nations, and hast sinned against thy soul." They have put other nations to shame. God says they're going to be shamed in return. The violent, verse 12, "The one that buildeth a town with blood, and establishes the city by iniquity." There's another woe pronounced upon them. Verse 15, "Woe unto him that giveth his neighbor drink, to thee that addest thy venom, and make him drunk also, that thou mayest look on nakedness." Those that have oppressed other people and manipulated other people and take advantage of them, there's going to be a woe upon them as well. Verse 19, "Woe unto him that saith to the wood, Awake, and to the dumb stone, Arise. Shall this teach?" Those idolaters in Babylon, they're going to be punishable. Because, by the way, that term woe, all of these woes that are pronounced, what does that mean? Take heed. It's a watch out. Judgment is coming is the idea behind all of this. And so Habakkuk wants to know, how can you use the Babylonians? And God says, I'm just using them for a little while, and then I'm going to punish them in turn. As a matter of fact, notice verse 8 and then again in verse 17, these punishments are specifically connected for the violence done to the land, to the city, and to all that dwell therein. Specifically, for what they are about to do to Judah, God is going to punish them. Now, interestingly, that reminds us that although Babylon did the right thing, they did what God wanted them to do, punish Judah, they did it for the wrong reason. Why is Babylon conquering Judah? Or anywhere else they conquered for that matter? The riches and the glory and the national expansion. It's national pride, and it's empire building is what it is, and consequently they're going to suffer for it as well. Habakkuk chapter 3 then is a poetic reflection and summation as Habakkuk is kind of looking back over all of God's dealings with his people. For example, Habakkuk 3 and verse 3, God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. The language there is very, very similar to what we read back in Deuteronomy chapter 33, describing God coming to Mount Sinai and bringing a covenant to the people Israel and making this agreement with them where he would be their God and they would be his people. You come down to verse 5. Before him, talking about before God, with the pestilence and fiery bolts went forth at his feet. Where do we read about pestilence in the Bible? I think probably that it goes back to the plagues that were brought upon Egypt and God's punishing them. You come to verse 12, for example. Thou didst march through the land in indignation. Thou didst thresh the nations in anger. It's language that recalls the conquest and the granting of Canaan to the people of Israel. In other words, so God has told Habakkuk what he's doing. And as Habakkuk is reflecting upon this, and he's thinking back about how God has dealt with Israel in the past, what is he beginning to realize? Whatever God has done, what was always behind it? He's going to triumph over evil, but he was always doing it in the best interest of his people. God has a plan that he is seeing fulfilled little by little by little. And that leads me to a lesson that I want to draw out. God plays the long game. What I mean by that is we mentioned earlier that God's schedule is not our schedule. And very often his plans stretch beyond human lifespans. Meaning we do not always get to see the next stage, the next step in God's plan. For example, here for Habakkuk, we mentioned the Babylonian invasion has not yet occurred. God tells him, I'm going to punish the Babylonians in turn, but when did that happen? Not for another 70 years, right? There's the 70 years that Israel spends in exile, and only then does Babylon fall to the Medo-Persians. Almost certainly, unless Habakkuk was either a very young man or lived to a very lengthy age, he's going to die before he sees that brought to fruition. He's going to die before he sees the definitive answer. How can you use Babylon? What's he got to do? If he's not going to live to see it, what's he got to do? He's got to take it on faith. I'm reminded then of what Peter says, 2 Peter 3 and following. Knowing this first, that in the last day mockers shall come with mockery, walking after their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For from the day that the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they willfully forget, that there were heavens from of old, and an earth compacted out of water and amidst water by the word of God, by which means the world that was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens that now are and the earth by the same word have been stored up for fire, being reserved against the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. There's also a lesson here, I think, that we need to remember, that when we are uncertain about what God is doing in the present or is about to do in the future, we need to recall what he has done in the past. And as Habakkuk reflects here upon God's past dealings with his people, he finds God has always been just and righteous. And if God has always been just and righteous through the 6,000 years of human history to this point, what can we rightly and fairly expect about whatever time there might be going forward? It will be just and righteous as well, right? Whatever he does. Paul asked the question rhetorically, Romans 8, 31 and 32. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? He that spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not also with him freely give us all things? How can Paul be so confident about whatever might happen for him going forward? He remembers God's already done the biggest thing, right? He's already taken care of the biggest problem we're ever going to face in sending his son Jesus to the cross. We can confidently expect him to handle things going forward. Okay. the most beautiful part of the book. Faith triumphant. Come down to verse 16 here in Habakkuk chapter 3. I heard and my body trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered into my bones, and I trembled in my place, because I must wait quietly for the day of trouble, for the coming of the people that invadeth us. For though the fig tree shall not flourish, neither shall fruit be in the vines, the labor of the olive shall fail, and the field shall yield no food. The flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Okay, so two things to notice here, first of all. One, Habakkuk has accepted God's schedule. He says, I'm going to wait quietly for the day of trouble. He has accepted that he's accepted that things are going to get bad, will get bad for God's people. I mean, because read there verse 17. In that day and age, what were you dependent upon for your food, for your welfare, for your just day-to-day existence? Your crops and your herds, right? So if the fields fail and the flock is cut off and there's no fruit in the vines, what's he saying? If it gets as bad as it possibly can, yet, another small word that's got a big importance, yet I will rejoice in Jehovah. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Jehovah the Lord is my strength, and he maketh my feet like hinds' feet, and will make me to walk upon my high places. You see, even though it seems like things are as hopeless as they possibly can be, he is still going to find joy in his God. He is still going to hope in and trust in the Lord. And that is what it means for the righteous to live by faith. Are we always going to see what God is doing? No. Are we always going to understand how it's going to work out? No. But what do? We have faith. We trust him. Habakkuk, kind of quickly here, it's not a treaty, the book is not a treaty on God, but it does mention several truths about God. God is eternal. Habakkuk 1 and verse 12, art thou not from everlasting? God is personal. He's described there in Habakkuk 1 and verse 12 again as my God, my Holy One. The God that Habakkuk is able to rejoice in is one that is close at hand, one that is connected to him. He is holy. We see that Habakkuk 1 in verse 13. Purer of eyes than to behold evil. Thou canst not look on perverseness, in the sense of God can't look on evil with punishment or with approval. If something needs to be punished, God is going to handle it. He's a God who communicates. Habakkuk 2 verse 2. Write the vision and make it plain upon tablets, that he may run that readeth it. God wants his word to be understood. God is sovereign. Habakkuk 2 and verse 20. Jehovah is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Even those things that may seem unbelievable to us, like God raising up the Chaldeans to punish his people, who is still in control? God. You add all of this up. God is eternal. God is personal. God is holy. God is one who communicates. God is the one who is sovereign. You add all that up, and that tells us God is trustworthy. Which ultimately that is the point and aim of the book. The growth of faith from perplexity and doubt to the height of absolute trust is one of the beautiful aspects of the book. Now, I will mention this, because Habakkuk is not directly mentioned he's not mentioned by name in the New Testament, but that statement, the righteous shall live by faith, appears 3 times in the New Testament. Romans chapter 1, verse 17, for therein is revealed a righteousness of God from faith unto faith, as it is written, but the righteous shall live by faith. There he's talking about the gospel, the faith. It's talked about in Romans 1 and verse 16. That is the means of salvation for mankind. The expression, again, is found in Galatians 3, verse 11. Now that no man is justified by the law before God is evident, for the righteous shall live by faith. It's our faith in God rather than our connection to Abraham or obedience to the law that produces righteousness or produces blessings. And then lastly, Hebrews 10, verse 38 and 39. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrink back, my soul hath no pleasure in him. We need to maintain our faith, that is, our faithfulness, if we are to be pleasing to God. That's the story, the message of Habakkuk. Thank you so very much.
Number 624. 624. We'll sing the first and the second verse. The church is one foundation, is Jesus Christ the Lord. She is his new creation, God, water, and the Word. From heaven he came and sought her to be his holy bride. With his own blood he bought her, and for her life he died. Elect from every nation, yet one o'er all the earth. Her charge to us salvation, one Lord, one faith, one birth, one holy name she blesses, for takes one holy word, and to the hope she presses, with every grace endued.
.454 will be our song of encouragement in just a moment. You know, there are some stories in the Bible that will leave you wondering, why is this in here? What does this have to do with me? Genesis chapter 9, verses 20 and following. And Noah began to be a husbandman and planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren about it. And Shem and Japheth took a garment, and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. It's probably not obvious, but this is an eternally relevant passage. It starts with a scandal. The tabloids of this day and age would have read, "Preacher becomes drunk and exposes himself." You know, gossip columnists today would be salivating over a story like that. It should not be a newsflash. Righteous people make mistakes. It should not even necessarily be a newsflash. Sometimes righteous people make shameful mistakes. But it's treated like front page news. Some people love to see the righteous toppled from their towers. And some people like to be the one that has the juiciest secret. And so when there is a scandal, they can't wait to tell others about it. And that is what Ham did. He saw what his father, mind you, had done. And his initial reaction is, I got to start telling people about this. Then there's Shem and Japheth, who went to inconvenient lengths. Have you ever tried to walk backwards? Have you ever tried to walk backwards without looking where you're going? But they do this to protect the dignity of their father. Some of the details of the story, obviously, are a little bit obscure, but there should be no doubt as to who was right and who was wrong. Ham was cursed. Particularly, he was cursed, his descendants, beginning with Canaan. Genesis 9 and verse 25, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. In contrast with that, Shem and Japheth are blessed. Blessed be Jehovah, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Genesis 9, verses 25 and 26. And then there's also this question of the two groups here, Ham or Shem and Japheth, which of these sets of brothers acted most like God? As you think about that question, consider this statement from David, Psalm 85 and verse 2. Thou hast forgiven the iniquity of thy people. Thou hast covered all their sin. Here is the eternally relevant part of the story. How are we going to respond when we learn of another's scandal? Will we happily run along and do our part to make sure everybody knows about it? Or will we do what we can to keep things quiet? Not to cover up the sin itself and pretend like this was all okay, but to cover the shame that comes with it. I think it's pretty clear from the story which choice God would have us make. Maybe you realize tonight that there is something scandalous in your own life, something sinful in your own life that needs to be handled. The only one who can truly handle that is Jesus. So if you need to come to him, maybe you need to be baptized into Jesus Christ, to be washed with his blood, that your sins can be carried away forever. Maybe you are a Christian, but you've allowed scandal, sin back into your life, maybe spreading the sins and the scandals of somebody else. And you need to ask the Lord's forgiveness. Why not come back to him this evening? If you need to respond, please come while we stand and while we sing.
What can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes
before we dismiss, just a couple of updates, a couple of individuals I'd ask you to keep in your prayers. Aunt Shirley is having a PET scan tomorrow. She's been undergoing several months of treatments now for her cancer. They're going to try and gauge the progress of that. I know she would love to hear a good report. I think we all would. Let's be praying about that. And then also tomorrow morning, Heather's dad, Lynn Smith, is scheduled for a procedure. They'll be doing, hopefully, removing a skin cancer from his scalp and also some tests to see if there's any possibility that is spread. We would appreciate, obviously, as well, some good news from that. So please keep us in your prayers, especially as we'll be traveling down to Memphis here in just a moment to be with him for tomorrow. Anything else that we need to mention? All right. You have a closing song?
Let's sing it. First, we'll take the name of Jesus, and Tim Fox will lead us in that part. Take the name of Jesus with you, child of sorrow and of woe. It will joy and comfort give you. Take it then where you go. Precious name, oh how sweet, hope of earth and joy of heaven. Precious name, oh how sweet, hope of earth and joy of heaven.
Father in heaven, we're thankful for this midweek study period, Father, that we may come here this evening to sing songs of praise to Thee and study another portion of Thy Word. We're thankful for the lessons that have been presented here this evening, especially the one Brother Serge presented on the prophets. May we glean from Thy Word this week and let our light so shine that others may see our good works. Be with us as we're about to be dismissed and go with us home. Be with Brother Serge as they travel to Memphis. Forgive us any unforgiven sin. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.